In the last couple of weeks, while we began mentioning our amazing case interview end-to-end secret program, there have been so many aspiring consultants around the world asking about this. Well, this program is designed to help build the foundation and skill set comprehensively in all three aspects of the case interview. 1, how to do better math in cases. 2, how to have a better business intuition, how to be more insightful in cases. And 3, how to build a strong set of consulting habits to demonstrate in cases. What are must-have tips and techniques to apply? In our program, we tackle the third aspect by conducting real case interviews with various candidates and show the audience the specific feedback in that context. Because so many people are interested in knowing more about this, today I'm happy to share with you a sample of how an interview in that third aspect of our program would look. We will go into the first half of the case in this example. Hi, this is Kim, and welcome to another performance in the tips and techniques part of our amazing end-to-end program. You're about to hear a really interesting performance. There is a common myth that profitability cases are easier. Well, for beginners, that may make sense, but I would argue that profitability cases can be really tricky, and the candidates without good foundations will make about the same level of mistakes regardless of any type of the case that it is. The profitability case we are about to watch will show that. It's a very unconventional profitability situation. It started out like a typical one, but getting more and more tricky towards the end. The candidate is fairly good in terms of business intuition, but the tips and techniques aspect needs a lot of fine-tuning. Now let's go ahead and get started. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. It's always exciting to do cases. So are you ready to get into it?
Sure, of course.
Okay. So your client today is an internet music broadcasting company. For simplicity reasons, let's go ahead and call them Pandora. Pandora broadcasts music through a couple of channels, through their website, through mobile apps, and through a built-in car radio. In terms of revenue model, Pandora gains case either from selling ads to partners or collecting royalty from listeners for the free ad version. Pandora is a very large company in terms of market share, but they've actually been losing money. The company just raised a big amount of cash through an IPO, and investors believe in the company's future and its stock is doing well. However, the management would like to grow with a good foundation. Pandora has to make a profit soon. How would you help your client?
Okay. First, can I ask a couple questions just to clarify?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the client's business model is to deliver music to customers through 3 channels: internet website, mobile apps, and a built-in car radio. And the client capitalizes by inserting ads while playing music or from the royalty fees from customers?
Right.
So vendors, or partners I should say, will pay the company for inserted ads, right?
Correct. Sometimes the amount will be calculated based on the number of displayed ads, but sometimes it's calculated as a certain percentage of the revenue that our partners generate through the ads.
Okay, I see. This is a very large company, but they aren't making money, and the CEO wants to at least break even?
Yes. It's actually a little better to play back the case information and ask clarifications. The candidate did not distinguish between the two and do both at the same time. Also, the candidate was asking these clarifications in a bit unorganized and unstructured fashion. This is not something terrible, but could have been better, especially when this is the very first part of the case, where crucial first impressions are being formed. My pitch would sound like this. That's a very interesting problem, and I am happy to get the chance to solve it. First of all, let me play back my understanding of the case context and key objectives. Then I would like to ask a few clarifying questions regarding a few terminology and concepts. Both of these are to make sure that I will be solving the right problem. So here's my understanding of the case. The client is ABC. Here are some DEF facts about the situation we just talked about. And the key case question is X, Y, and Z. Does that correctly and adequately summarize the case? Once the interviewer confirms, I would move to the clarification part as follows. Now I would like to ask a few clarification questions. There are 3 of them. Number 1, number 2, and number 3. You may take the above pitch for granted, but I think that this is a perfect example of how you should open any case. Every detail matters. We will point out those details in just a few seconds, but before we do that, it's actually very helpful if you can go back, listen carefully to the above pitch, and try to point out the great components yourselves. Only after that, go back to this point and learn all together. Alrighty, let's break down the perfect opening. First of all, you heard me say, that's a very interesting problem and I am happy to get a chance to solve it. This seems trivial, but is really very beneficial in multiple ways. A, I bought myself a couple of seconds to calm down and get focused. B, by nature, we as humans unconsciously like those who give us compliments. Nothing better than opening the case with a modest compliment to the interviewer. And C, I showed my great attitude toward the case, which the interviewer would assume the same with real future consulting business problems. You should do that in your interviews too. Say it and accompany it with the best smile you can give on your face. It shows that you're not afraid of any problems. In fact, you love them and you are always ready for them. Secondly, I did what I referred to as the MAP habit, which is to always say what you are about to do and then do it. Just like somebody in the car shows the driver the route before cruising on the road. The driver would love it. This is where I said, let me play back my understanding of the case context and key objectives. Then ABC. Third, right at the beginning of the case, I try to be crystal clear and easy to follow. I don't let the interviewer get confused between playing the case versus asking clarification questions. I distinguish between the two really carefully. This habit probably doesn't change the outcome of how the case goes that much, but it certainly significantly changes the impression the interviewer has of me. Fourth, in playing back the case, each person would have a different way to play it back. But there are 3 buckets to always include. A, who is the client? B, the facts regarding the client and the situation. And C, the key question and the objectives of the case. Fifth, after playing the case context and objectives, I pause for a second and align with the interviewer. Does it correctly and adequately summarize the case? This is a habit that every consulting manager loves for young consultants to do. Nobody wants the first-year folks to spend weeks of passion and hard work building an Excel model that the team can't even use. This habit is taught extensively at McKinsey, Bain, and BCG, so interviewers love somebody that exhibit this habit often in the case interviewer. Lastly, when asking clarification questions, you hear me number them very carefully to create the strong impression that I am very organized and structured. I said I have 3 clarifying questions. Then I number them as I go through each. Number 1, number 2, and number 3. Sometimes during interviews, it's hard to know exactly how many items you're going to get. One way is to take timeouts often to carefully plan your pitch. If this isn't possible in certain situations, you may skip telling how many items you have, but you should definitely still number your questions number 1, number 2, and so on.
Is there anything else we should be aware of?
Yeah, the company needs to turn that over within 12 months. Otherwise, the CEO worries that the stock price will be hurt.
Okay. So solutions, if any, have to work within 12 months.
Yeah.
I see. Can I have a minute to gather my thoughts?
Sure, go ahead. Just a moment ago, the candidate actually exhibited a very good habit. After going through his clarification questions, the candidate ends by asking the "Is there anything else?" question. In this case, I actually give out an important piece of data. Though this is not very common, as not every interviewer is that generous in giving out data, this is a habit management consultants have to do every day when talking to experts, clients, or key stakeholders. The key is to get the most data and insights out of every interview, and this is the type of open-ended question every consultant asks several times a day. To show off this habit in a case interview is very good.
Okay, so clearly the objective here is to have a break-even net income within 12 months. My plan is to look at the revenue and the cost, compare that with historical data and data if available from the competitors. And based on comparisons, I can draw conclusions as to why the company is losing money and propose solutions to turn over their company net loss. Does that sound like a fair approach to you?
There are three things I would like you to pay attention to. First, it took the candidate up to 72 seconds to gather his thoughts. This is a little too long in a case interview. I intentionally leave the 72 seconds of emptiness in the recording so you can get an idea of how long that actually is in real situations. But worth noting here is not only that. While in some very complicated and weird cases, it's okay to take that long to really think and gather ideas, in this case, the approach as proposed by the candidate is very simple. For this very approach, I think no more than 15 to 20 seconds should be used. Number two, with that said, I have to tell I really like the fact that this candidate exhibits the map habit. Before going straight to the approach, he draws the overall approach first. Number three, you also see here that the candidate tries to align the approach with me by asking me my thoughts on it. As I just said on the previous comment, this is a great habit to have. Not only does it help reduce the chances of going into the wrong direction in the interview, but it also creates good impressions. Consulting interviewers love people doing it often.
Fair enough. Thanks. So can I have information on the company revenue? Any data on the revenue?
Here we see a not really bad response, but for sure it could be much better. The candidate was going into the first branch of the analysis, which is revenue. I would fix this in three aspects. First, even though we just talked about the overall approach, it's still better to briefly set up the issue tree first, then clearly note that you are going into one of those branches. Second, this is not a must, but I always try to make my hypothesis as explicit as possible. Here the candidate just implicitly made a hypothesis that the problem is on the revenue side. The best way to show our hypothesis-driven mindset is to explicitly say it. Third, you hear this a ton of times in our end-to-end program, but I'm going to repeat it here again and again. It's better to show the habit of aligning, always. Don't just go into revenue. Before doing that, give the interviewer a chance to agree or to actually guide you to cost. So, summarizing the above insights, my pitch would sound something like this. So, as we just discussed, a profit problem is either caused by revenue or by cost. Unless you would like to go into cost first, let's hypothesize that the problem is on revenue. I would like to look deeper into revenue. Do we have any data on the revenue? And while saying this, you should literally draw an issue tree and point to each part of it as you speak. Yes, the 2013 revenue was $425 million. The year before that, the revenue was $275 million.
And do we have any data on the revenue of competitors?
There is an interesting case interview tip I want to point out right here. Notice how the candidate responds after receiving 2 data points from me. He went straight into the next question without at least acknowledging the data received and also without briefly analyzing it. I'm glad that the candidate makes this mistake. Well, not glad for him, but for the greater audience of this program. I would like to introduce you to the perfect habit of what you should react and do every time you get any piece of data during case interviews. So the 3 things you need to do are the following. Step 1. Say, that's an interesting piece of data. This acknowledges for the interviewer that you have received and understand the data. This also buys you a little time. And furthermore, it's always a good thing to give out modest compliments to the interviewer. Step 2, describe the data, how it looks. Is there anything worth noting in the trend? In this case, we should point out that revenue actually grew by more than 50%. Also notice here that I immediately quantify the difference in specific quantitative measurements, in this case percentage. Saying revenue went up is good, but it's great to be able to say that revenue went up by more than 50%. Step 3. Link the trend identified back to the original case question and the hypothesis you are trying out. Does it prove, disprove, or open up new investigation to really test the hypothesis? In this case, this data piece actually opens up new investigating areas to test the hypothesis that the bottleneck is on revenue. My sample pitch for this step 3 would sound like this. It's interesting that revenue went up by quite a bit. However, to be able to fully reject our hypothesis on the revenue, I would like to compare our revenue to the competitors as well. Then only at this point, after going through these 3 steps above, should I ask the competitor's revenue like the candidate did. Notice here that I ended up asking the same questions the candidate did. This shows that the candidate does have a good intuition and good thought processes. It's just that he did all of these implicitly in his head. In consulting case interviews, it's always good to do everything as explicitly as possible. Not only is it easier to follow, but it helps show that you have a great thought process. Actually, we don't. But the competitor's data is not going to be helpful anyway. We know that since we are dominating the market, we hold more than 70% of the market share. We set the sector's standard on most facets, actually.
Oh, okay. Does it mean the other companies are losing money as well?
Well, yes. Most of our competitors are losing money, and some break even.
Interesting. Probably it's an industry-wide problem, and as the market leader, we've got to solve it first. Okay, I will stick with the approach. I will dig. I will go deeper into revenue then.
A few things I would like to point out here. Number 1, the candidate actually did slightly better here after receiving the data point. He did steps 1 and 2 of those steps we just talked about in the previous comment. However, step 3 is missing. The candidate certainly can tighten the insight closer to the overall case question and the hypothesis. Number 2, notice how the candidate paused for 3 to 4 seconds in between his response. Being silent in the case interview should be avoided. As candidates, we can always be in 2 modes, the speaking and the timeout mode. There's no gray section in between. So to fix this particular mistake in this very case, the candidate may A, ask for a short timeout, or B, try to think out loud and fill the empty space. Usually we choose A for complicated situations and a fair amount of time is needed. In situations like this, the candidate can do just fine by thinking out loud. Number 3, it's good that after deviating a little from the original framework, the candidate remembers to trace back to the structure. This seems trivial, but I've seen countless candidates, even good ones, completely forget the original framework and totally just go with the wind without announcing anything clearly. Well, the 3 points above are all about habits, tips, and tricks. Now let me ask you a question about business intuition here. Now that the candidate has looked at revenue through the historical and competition lenses, if he still wants to run more tests on revenue, what would he look at? You have 10 seconds to think about this, starting now. Feel free to pause the video now if you'd like to take more time. Otherwise, listen closely to how the case continues. Okay, go ahead.
I like to know how we can segment the revenue and what is the revenue from each segment?
Actually, that's a question for you. What do you think is a natural way of segmenting?
I'm not really sure. This seems to be a new industry to me.
Okay, let me give you a hint. How does the client generate revenue?
The client generates revenue by ads or by royalty fees.
So yeah, after referencing revenue to its historical and competitions number, the third test is often the breakdown of revenue. The candidate did a good job here. So far, he has led the case in a quite appropriate direction. However, if you listen closely to the above pitch, you may notice that there is a very noticeable silence of about 5 seconds. As we just talked about earlier, this is not good. You should either take a time out or think out loud. Also, it's worth noting here that the candidate doesn't seem to actively try to solve the case. Instead of really trying himself to figure out how to segment this industry first, he leans on the interviewer to provide that information. Asking the interviewer on the first time is okay, as sometimes it saves time for the case. But easily giving up after being asked back is unacceptable. A lot of time in case interviews and also in real consulting projects, candidates and young consultants feel like they don't know enough to make judgments, to give an opinion, to structure, to segment, etc. In many, many occasions, the answer is more simple than we realize. I remember a McKinsey partner in my office once told us on a training that we shouldn't be afraid to challenge and go beyond PDs. PDs are like internal knowledge documents in McKinsey. It's just that somebody just as smart as you are, somebody probably not as updated as you are, and somebody may not know about the specific situation as well as you do. That is to say that we, even as an experienced candidates and as young consultants, can be very capable of making great calls on a lot of things, including how to segment an industry. In this case, the answer is more simple than we thought. The natural segmentation is just based on revenue sources mentioned at the beginning of the case. The candidate could have got this very easily if he had tried. Correct. And that's the natural segmentation. There are two revenue streams, which are advertisements and royalty fees. The revenue from advertising was $375 million in 2013 and $240 million in 2012.
Okay, and how about the revenue from royalty fees?
Can you calculate that based on the data I've given you? Here we can see that the candidate makes the same mistake again. He wasn't trying his best on this. Making mistakes once is not good, but making the same mistake twice is very bad. In management consulting, every young consultant is taught about this. We should always try the best on our own before seeking the help from leadership. Because number one, leadership's time is a sacred resource. And number two, we are more capable than we think on a lot of things. To help you understand how important this habit is in management consulting, let me share with you a story probably I won't ever forget for the rest of my life. It's the story of how my engagement manager coached me on this very habit. So on one nice day in my second project with McKinsey, I was working on a big chunk of data, and I realized, oh geez, I forgot how to use a pivot table. I learned it in college, but it had been years back. So I came to my EM, who was sitting just next to me, and asked, "Hey, Mr. EM, can you teach me how to use a pivot table?" As he was always a nice guy, he gave me a big smile and said, "Of course, Kim. To use a pivot table, you only need the following 4 steps. Step 1, hit F1. Step 2, type how to use a pivot table. Step 3, hit enter. Step 4, read. Good luck." McKinsey and other consulting firms all have really strong people development culture. Once you are there, you will see very often that even busy people like partners are very willing to step away from work to coach you and develop you. But even with that, everybody is expected to try his or her best at any problem first. We only come to leadership when we have to. So this candidate here asked for a piece of data that can very well be calculated based on previously available data. This is a big no-no in consulting case interviews. Another possible reason why he did that may be that he didn't take good and organized notes. That's why he's not crystal clear about what data he has and what data he can calculate based on that.
Actually, yes, I can. Hold on. So, royalty revenue was $50 million for 2013 and $35 million for 2012. Interesting. The royalty revenue is actually just about 12% of the total revenue. Do you mind if I take a few seconds to organize my thoughts?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I think I want to shift gears here. I want to go to the cost side. But before that, let me make a small summarization of what we have here on the revenue side. So first, the total revenue increased by about 50%. This rate is true for both segments, advertising and royalty. Second, revenue from advertising makes up about more than 85% of the revenue. And I guess the reason I want to shift gears to the cost side is because I want to know how the cost changes in comparison to revenue change rate. Do you have any data on the cost side?
This is a critical point in this case. The candidate moves from revenue to the cost side. And as you have probably known by now, at every key point in the case, we would want to pause and do the map habit, summarizing where we have been and saying where we are going next. The candidate actually did that here. His pitch was fairly good. But if you would like to hear how a great pitch would sound like, here it is. Thank you for your patience. We've been analyzing the revenue aspect of the case and have gathered some very interesting insights. Number 1, total revenue increased by about 50%. Number 2, revenue data from competitors are not available and they aren't relevant. And number 3, 85% of our revenue comes from the advertising segment. All of these 3 insights have strong implications on how we would do next to solve the problem. While we cannot at this point reject the hypothesis that the bottleneck is in revenue, this data shows that the problem is on the cost side, or at least is very suggestive that the problem is on the cost side. And on the cost side, here are a few things I would be very interested in finding out more. Number 1, how has cost been changing in comparison to revenue? And number 2, since 85% of revenue is from the advertising segment, I would like to look specifically at the cost devoted for this segment. Does this approach look good to you? Now you may want to go back, listen to the sample pitch again, and try to point out what makes it a great pitch. Anyway, here we go. Number 1, you see that I open my pitch by thanking the interviewer. Remember, this pitch is right after a short timeout. On one aspect, this helps please the interviewer a little bit. But more importantly, this is to show the interviewer that I am a very client-friendly type of person. In management consulting, in addition to a super brain power, a great deal of people skills is needed. In addition to judging your analytical skills, interviewers also look to see if you've got that people part. They literally ask themselves during the interviews, do I trust this person enough to put him in front of the client to represent me and my firm? Will the client love him? Will he enhance the long-term relationships with my key clients, or is he going to bomb them? Etc. So whenever possible, even though details like this, try to implicitly tell the interviewer that yes, you will make the client happy. Number 2, I structured my pitch very clearly. Listeners are very clear that there are 2 parts of my pitch: the revenue summarization part and the plan for the cost part. Within each part, there are detailed items with numbers. Number 3, I stay very close to the hypothesis. Like I said on a previous comment, there are only 3 things that we can do regarding a hypothesis: to confirm it, to reject it, or to open up a new area of investigation. In this case, I clearly noted that I have not rejected the revenue hypothesis, but I would like to open up new areas for investigation, which is cost. And lastly, number 3, I didn't flat out ask for cost data right away. I gave the interviewer a chance to approve or disapprove of my approach. This helps reduce my chance of going into irrelevant areas and also shows my respect to the interviewer, which is beneficial in multiple ways. Now come back to the case. The candidate has just asked for a few data points on the cost side. Okay, so our dear candidate has just moved into the cost part of his overall approach. I hope the massive amount of insightful feedback on the revenue part so far is already really helpful to your preparation. To see the whole video and others, join many others across the world who've checked out our case interview end-to-end secret program. At Management Consulting Prep, we believe everybody can make it to consulting. Are you a believer?